Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Wednesday, April 30th, 2025, and on Wednesdays we talk about emotional well-being and relationships. Last Wednesday we posed the question, are there people out there who are intentionally cruel and malicious, or knowingly act in morally reprehensible ways? Maybe they're evil in some sense. And I argued there are actually two different types of evil. The first is called sadistic evil, and the second, justificatory evil. And so a week ago, we focused on sadistic evil. That is, people who act in harmful ways toward others in a predatory fashion, or purely for personal gain and pleasure. These are admittedly a much smaller number of people, thankfully, not more than maybe 3 to 5% of the population at most. And these are folks who, again, just genuinely act with cruelty towards others, often rooted in personality disorders or the byproducts of severe forms of abuse and abandonment themselves. And I discussed 16 different signs that one should look for in other people to help determine whether they were inclined to act with sadistic evil or not. In contrast, justificatory evil represents a second type, a different type of evil. And this refers to those who act in harmful ways towards others, even to the point of physical harm and murder, basically because they believe that their actions are somehow justified. Hence the term justificatory evil. They might rationalize their actions, for example, as being justified in the service of a greater good. We could say that their evil's rooted in a kind of misguided moralism. People sometimes develop and abide by moral frameworks that actually justify the use of cruelty to inflict pain and suffering upon others. But why? Well, in general, because they have some type of a serious grievance or a problem with other individuals or entire groups of people. And they think that such people then deserve to be punished, and punished severely. And so the cruelty inflicted represents their way of exercising power and social control over those whose behaviors, or just perhaps their very being, somehow offends the morally self-righteous. Unfortunately, justificatory evil is far more commonplace and widespread throughout the world. I'm not sure we could even come up with a reliable estimate in terms of how many people or what percentage, if you will, might be driven by different forms of justificatory evil. So instead, I'll provide something of a typology with different categories and examples of distinct types of justificatory evil. And we'll start with the most obvious cases. So the most extreme forms of justificatory evil throughout human history have been those instances when people have attempted to eliminate whole groups of people, defined as subhuman or undesirable for whatever reasons. And there are many instances of well-known or large-scale genocides throughout history, which generally, when we think about genocides, we think about the intentional and concerted effort to eliminate an entire, typically ethno-racial or ethno-religious group of some kind or another. And most famously, of course, people everywhere who are familiar with are probably familiar with the Holocaust during the Second World War, where mainly they were targeting Jewish people throughout Europe, but also the Romani and a few other categories as well. And this then involved mass shootings and then poison gas in extermination camps. And it's in this particular context that Hannah Arendt articulated her view of the banality of evil. In other words, such evil differs then from sadistic evil and psychopathy because people, in many cases, simply conform to the dominant norms, accept the conventional tropes, and eventually normalize immoral principles and act accordingly. You might simply be raised in a family or a community or the society as a whole that has normalized dehumanizing beliefs about certain peoples. In the United States, as with many instances of colonial expansionism and imperialism, including in Australia and New Zealand, you can see examples. The Trail of Tears that involved the forced displacement of approximately 60,000 people of the 5 civilized tribes between 1830 and 1850, and the additional thousands of Native Americans who were ethnically cleansed in the case of the United States. The California genocide, too, was a series of systematized killings of thousands of indigenous peoples in California, again by the U.S. government, and by private citizens, too, in the mid-19th century. There's the Armenian genocide during World War I, the Bangladesh genocide that involved the ethnic cleansing of Bengalis, or especially Bengali Hindus residing in East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. There's the Cambodian genocide perpetrated by the Khmer Rouge, and the Rwandan genocide of Hutus killing more than 500,000 Tutsis. And there have been many additional instances over the years, including several smaller scale instances, or what some scholars refer to as proto-genocides. Some would argue, for example, what's been happening in Gaza in terms of the Israeli government targeting not just Hamas, but the widespread killing of Palestinian peoples more generally, as being an example. And again, there are many other cases as well. A second form involves slavery. We're all familiar, too, with slave systems in general. There have been actually many different forms of human enslavement over the years, spanning the globe as well. But the cruelest and most dehumanizing form has been described as chattel slavery. The slaves are legally rendered the personal property, chattel, of the slave owner. And as property, then, they can be bought and sold or traded at will, or at the discretion or the preference of their owners. And they're held in bondage against their will, typically used routinely as a source of forced labor. So, while the most infamous case arguably involves the United States prior to the Civil War, history confirms that slaveries existed across classical Greece, across the Roman Empire, as well as medieval Egypt, and then parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil for sure, Cuba, and Haiti, among other places. And so what's the broader point then of slave systems? All again require specialized justification systems, rooted in beliefs that allow the dominant group to dehumanize or treat slaves as fundamentally inferior in some way or another. And if you can arrive at these sorts of rationalizations, then you can ultimately conclude that such folks are deserving of the cruelty. They're deserving of their station in life. And by the way, the same beliefs, or this type of belief system, typically allows us to reason with equal passion and fervor that there are some among us who are likewise more deserving, or having a more privileged position or station in life, or perhaps even, in some cases, divinely inspired. And in turn, then, people punish the others to signal their own goodness and as a reminder of their own superiority. Then you have the lynch mobs that emerged, for example, in the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, but basically extended the same logic of targeting people with extrajudicial killings that were mainly, the people that were mainly targeted were African Americans, usually based on dubious accusations, which were then used to justify this type of vigilante justice. Lynching is very much similar to what these days we would refer to as hate crimes, right? Modern parlance, designed to spread fear and intimidation broadly across the targeted population. Lynching allows the group again to establish their self-proclaimed moral superiority over some inferior others who stand as symbols of that which is to be condemned. Think of the tragic case of Matthew Shepard in the United States, who was beaten, tortured, suffered severe head injuries, and then was ultimately left to die near Laramie, Wyoming on October 6, 1998, ostensibly just because he was gay. And then as a final example, most forms of terrorism involve the use of violence, often targeting innocent civilians indiscriminately, again, to spread fear and intimidation. And it's not too difficult then for most of us to associate the coordinated terrorist attacks of 9/11 that killed almost 3,000 people as a classic example then of justificatory evil. In fact, here's what Osama bin Laden said a few years after 9/11 as a form of justifying what happened. And I'm quoting from one of his speeches. "I say to you, Allah knows that it had never occurred to us to strike the towers. But after it became unbearable and we witnessed the oppression and tyranny of the American and Israeli coalition against our people in Palestine and Lebanon, it came to my mind. In those difficult moments, many hard to describe ideas bubbled up in my soul, but in the end they produced an intense feeling of rejection of tyranny and gave birth to a strong resolve to punish the oppressors. And as I looked out at the demolished towers in Lebanon, it entered my mind that we should punish the oppressor in kind, and that we should destroy the towers in America in order that they taste some of what we tasted, and so that they could be deterred from killing our women and children." End quote. And so, again, these are just some of the many instances of the main sources of justificatory evil. But basically, anyone who's engaged in genocides, in chattel slavery, lynchings, hate crimes, and terrorism are typically driven by different forms of justificatory evil. There are arguably additional categories we might consider too, such as honor killings, and certainly the torturing of prisoners. And here's the general point then. Wherever people believe that they are justified to inflict what we often describe colloquially as cruel and unusual punishment, then they're on the slippery slope of engaging in justificatory evil. If you believe that you have a right to inflict cruel and unusual punishment because certain others in the world deserve the pain, then you're engaging in justificatory evil. And this is often the greatest challenge then that people face who believe in civil society and the dignity of every human being. We're quite adept at fashioning explanations to justify even the most heinous acts imaginable, whether rooted in religion, racism, or radical extremism of any kind. And hence we have a responsibility to ask ourselves and our families and our tribes and our societies as a whole, not only if certain people should be punished, because clearly that's the case in regulating human behavior in civil society, but we also have to ask what are the reasonable and humane ways to deal with people who violate our norms or our laws? And what are the limits beyond which we cannot and should not go to exercise social control, even in cases where we can clearly agree that people should be held accountable and should be punished for their wrongdoing? And of course, I don't have a simple or definitive answer, but if we hope to figure out a long-term set of workable solutions to our problems, we have to slow down. We have to engage in serious moral reasoning and discussions to figure out what's sensible and acceptable in our different social environments. And then, if you're inclined to think of whole categories of people based on, again, race or religion or whatever your prejudices, if you somehow think they're deserving of being treated cruelly, well, then you've got an even more serious cultural problem and a human dignity problem. So hopefully, if and when we are confronted with people who engage in cruelty and who commit acts of justificatory evil, hopefully we can recognize that and intervene in helpful ways. And let's not kid ourselves, though, because there are conditions in which that can be extremely difficult. What would you or I have done if we'd lived in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and we bore witness to the implementation of genocidal policies? Would we have remained silent? Or think of any groups of people who end up targeting and scapegoating others, again, to inflict cruelty and pain upon those whom they despise. Is that okay with you? If you find yourself answering that question with a qualified yes, and certainly with a yes, of course, then I'd ask you again to slow down and reconsider. If you're smart enough to come up with reasons to justify treating people horribly, whether you think it's deserved or not, then you're smart enough to come up with different approaches too. We all know that there are many solutions to the problems we confront. So our challenge then is always to come up with better and healthier solutions, both to avoid inflicting evil upon others and to figure out more creative ways to respond to those who start sliding down that slippery slope of evil already. And if you're one of those people who's engaging in justificatory evil, I'd ask you to start by focusing on yourself and what's driving your behavior, and please, if possible, get some help. All right, until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and as ever, dole out hugs in abundance. Ciao for now.